and you want to share one or two or more that you love to read, let us know that. And if you just want to say hello and tell us where you are, we'd love it. And if you want everybody to see what you're writing, send it to panelists and attendees. And if you only want to send it to myself or Sharon, then just send it to panelists and we'll be the ones to see it. And thanks for being here. I actually just read, because Sharon told me about it, this novella, A Convenience Store Woman. I don't know if anyone else has read it. I loved it. And I might mention a few things about it today. So there you go. And it turns out from talking to Sharon that I've read quite a few novellas, because so many of the books that I read probably in high school and college, she would consider novellas. We'll hear more about that as well. So welcome, and we're glad that you're here. We're live on YouTube. How exciting.
Let's see. I'm still fooling around with the light, Becca.
That's good. I think what you just did there. Yeah, something, probably there's like a shadow that's kind of changing things a little bit.
Yeah. I've got a different. Okay. I don't know. Anyway, people can see me.
Great. I think you look.
Oh, thanks. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
I won't worry about it then.
Yeah.
Okay.
So here we go. I'm just gonna check one thing out. I want to make sure our little oh, good. Yeah.
So you liked Convenience Store Woman?
I really did. I really did. And it was so great to read it and then be reading your book at the same time, because I was noticing, I mean, just immediately some of the craft elements that you mentioned that are related to novellas that obviously are happening in this little guy. But I loved it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's really, it gives you a really good picture of the culture, I think. And it's such a clear novella. I mean, it has all the characteristics that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, and even right down to the name. In fact, I include it. It's on this PowerPoint that accompanies my talk, and because it I mean, there's another similar book that came out about a year and a half ago called Pizza Girl. I don't know if you read about that book. It was featured in Poets and Writers. You know how they do every year, debut novelists. And they have a number of emerging writers who are publishing their first novel. And the author who was talking about it said she had wanted people to be able to read it in one sitting. And that's a hallmark of the novella. Yeah. So that you can read it in one or two sittings. That's one of the real differences between a novella and a novel. It's a different reading experience.
Well, and I'm assuming, like, when you talk about and I know you're going to don't worry, everyone, we're going to get into all of this when the official presentation starts, but the Convenience Store Woman title, that's another sort of signature of a novella, right? That the title is really very direct and refers to often the main character or the narrator. Would that be right?
Yes, because I mean, this isn't always the case, but it's typical of a novella to be either named for the protagonist or to have a name like when I talk about is The Shop Girl, which Steve Martin wrote, and then there's Pizza Girl, which I just mentioned, and then then you have Ethan Frome. And you have a lot of them that are named, use the actual protagonist's name as the title for the book. So that's a feature of the novella.
So I'm so excited for your presentation, and
Thank you.
I love your book, and I'll mention this too when we start, but just think your book, it's obviously a craft book about writing the novella because it is called Writing the Novella, but there's just so much in it for whatever you're writing, that it's just, I hope everybody on this, webinar certainly, and I hope a lot of folks find it and just add it to I'm so excited to add it to my own shelf of books about writing. So,
well, that means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
It was really a wonderful project to work on, and I worked on it for, well, if you count the years that I was teaching a novella workshop. I've been working on it since 2011. That's the first year I taught a novella workshop. But then I continued to teach them, and I continued to read more novellas, and I just really got immersed in the whole thing.
Is it typical?
And that's fun.
I was just wondering, for MFA programs and creative writing programs, do they often have teaching the novella workshops, or was that a special workshop that you put on? I mean, I've heard of, I guess my question is it often that you get to teach a specific novella workshop as an instructor?
Not unless you propose it. I taught it first. I taught it as in the MFA program as a graduate fiction workshop instead of your standard workshop where people bring in chapters or they bring in stories and everybody's kind of on their own little track. I think it's kind of conducive to community for everybody to start at the same place and to be working on the same kind of thing, because the comments that you give to someone who's working on a short story are really different than the comments you give to somebody who's working on a novel, and you're looking at a chapter and not a whole manuscript. So there were a number of reasons why I decided to try to teach the novella, and it's worked out really well. So I think there are more and more people who want to teach novella workshops. I'm hoping my book will encourage that.
I think it will, for sure. So it is 8:00 now. I just want to again welcome everyone. Say thank you so much for being here. I love seeing the chat box getting some action. I know somebody that you met at Bookwoman has popped up in the chat box to say that they've taken your book back home and are reading it. So if you want everybody to be able to see what you're writing, which is a great way to connect with other writers, be sure to send your messages to all panelists and attendees, or all attendees and panelists. But otherwise, if you send it to just the panelists, we'll see it up here. And feel free to say hello and tell us a little bit more about yourself in the chat box if you'd like to, but we are going to I'm waiting for one more. Let me see if I can find my wonderful Susan post from Bookwoman. Not sure if Susan might be in the mix with the attendees or just not here yet, but I have a feeling she will be along shortly. And then we'll get started. Thanks for being here, everyone. Got folks from all over Texas. We got folks from Louisiana. I
used to live in Louisiana.
Oh yeah?
I lived in Ruston. That was the first job at Louisiana Tech. My husband, when he finished his PhD, that was the first job he got, was at Louisiana Tech. And I taught down the road in Monroe. So I know something of Louisiana.
You have a fan from your Taos conference days. When I first, oh gosh, was it when I became an agent? I don't know when it was, but I heard so many wonderful things about the Taos Writing Conference, and I never got to go, but I heard so many wonderful things, and it's just such an honor to get to talk to you after hearing about you and hearing your people sing your praises for so long. So popped up in Austin. I feel like we're lucky that we have you now in our Texas writing community.
Well, I'm delighted to get involved with the Texas writing community. I really am excited about it. I was born and raised in Texas. Most of my adult life, I've lived other places, particularly Albuquerque. But it's great. It's great to be here, and I'm really pleased to be part of the Writers League of Texas programming.
Well, I'll just mention one more time that if you're dropping stuff into the chat box and you want everyone to be able to see it, be sure to select the panelists and attendees option. It's that little blue bar right down there, right above where you type your message. We're getting a lot of great messages, but I think a lot of them are going just to the panelists. So if you want other folks to see it, be sure to send it to panelists and attendees. I'm going to get started with some announcements here at the top, and going to check one more time in our attendees area to see if I can find Susan. And if not, I'm going to guess she'll be joining us when she can. So here we go. I'm Becca Oliver. I'm the executive director at the Writers League of Texas. We're the organization putting on this event tonight. We put on programs for writers all year round. In the before times, a lot of them were in person. And since March of 2020, we've been doing a lot of programming for writers virtually. So I would encourage you to go to our YouTube channel. I'll drop the link into the chat box, because we have a lot of great programs that we've recorded over the last several months, and you might find a few things on there that interest you. I want to mention some upcoming events before we get started. So every month we do two what we call our write-ins every month. That's usually the first Saturday and the following ish Tuesday. And these are 3-hour blocks of time where you can show up virtually, hang out with us at the start. We say hello. You can say anything you want at the start. And then we turn off our video, we turn off our microphones, and we write. So if you're interested in just finding a room virtually full of other writers and spending a little time committing to your writing throughout the month, feel free to join us. You can find it on the website. You can easily RSVP. And our next one is this Saturday from 2 to 5 p.m. And then we'll be doing one on Tuesday, August 17th. Every month, we have our third Thursday panel discussion. Our panel discussion is focused on a different topic every month of interest to writers. So we are talking about writing YA or young adult today on our third Thursday panel for August. So on August 19th, we'll be joined by 3 wonderful writers. Our program director, Sam Babiak, is going to talk to them all about young adult fiction. And if you're interested or young adult curious in any way, we hope that you'll come out, hang out with us on Thursday, August 19th. We also do a program called WLT Off the Beaten Craft. These are often topics that are of interest to writers, but aren't necessarily focused strictly on craft. So we're doing one on a subject that I've heard a lot of people ask about, and I'm so excited to have the chance to have a presentation for you guys, the ins and outs of sensitivity reading. So if this is a topic that is of interest to you, or if you're just curious what this whole world of sensitivity reading is, come hang out with us on Thursday, August 26th. We'll have a great presentation for you. Oh, sorry, going back. And then we have another series called Ask Us Anything. We ask you to send in all of your questions on a particular topic, and then we bring really smart and interesting special guests in to answer those questions and then to answer any other questions in the room. So because we're leading into our big Agents and Editors Conference in September, On September 2nd, we're going to do an Ask Us Anything, the path to publication. We haven't announced our special guest yet, but they will be folks who work in the publishing industry. We're talking to some publishers, some executive editors, and we'll let you know as soon as we can on our website who they'll be. But if you have burning questions about the path to publication, our Ask Us Anything on September 2nd is for you. And then finally, I'll mention that we have our annual Agents and Editors Conference coming up on September 17th to the 19th. We are doing an in-person event in Austin for that weekend, but we're also doing, for the first time ever, a virtual event. And our virtual registration includes the opportunity to have a one-on-one consultation with a literary agent. So you can have a live virtual consultation. You can join us for our live webinars that are going to happen in the days leading up to the weekend. And then you'll receive recordings of the entire weekend, the breakout sessions and the general sessions. If you're interested in being here with us in person, we do have a lot of COVID protocols in place, and we're happy to share those with you. We're interested in making it the safest weekend that we possibly can. So you can pursue the in-person registration as well, but I would really encourage you to look at the virtual registration if that's something of interest to you. It's a great conference. We have a lot of wonderful agents who are participating. We have some pretty amazing published authors who are going to be in conversation and be on panels throughout the weekend. You can find lots of information on our website. And then I want to mention, and I don't think that Susan is here yet. If Susan is here, I do not know where she is, but I will mention that we love, love, love to support independent bookstores. We have so many wonderful independent bookstores in our community, both here in Austin, where we're talking to you from, but also all over Texas, and of course, so many indies all over the country. So Bookwoman is a local independent bookstore here in Austin. We have partnered with them for the last several of our WLT on the Craft of Writing events. And tonight we are so happy to be partnered with them again for this event. So I'll be dropping the link in the chat box for you so that you're able to buy both Writing the Novella, but also we'll have some other books that we may be mentioning throughout the evening. I can't say enough good things, but I will say even more good things about Writing the Novella. It's such a wonderful craft book. So I'd encourage you to remember that a great way to support guest presenters like Sharon, who I'm about to introduce, and then also just support indie bookstores is buying books from them, right?
That's it.
That's the way you do it.
Yes.
So here we go. I have to take a pause so that Evan is able to edit this later. So I'm going to take a pause and say, welcome everybody to our WLT on the Craft of Writing, Writing the Novella. Tonight's program features both a conversation with, but also a presentation from Sharon Ord Warner. For those of you who haven't joined us for one of these before, we do a series of programs, many different series of programs here at the Writers League of Texas, and On the Craft of Writing is one of them. We are always excited to be able to support or share as much craft information as we possibly can with writers. And I'm going to take a brief pause to welcome Susan Post from Bookwoman, who has just popped on to join us. And Susan, you're perfectly timed to say a few words, our wonderful partner for the evening.
Well, I'm so happy I made it. I just squeaked in from work, and I'm so excited to be at this presentation. I just met Sharon at the bookstore yesterday, and we had a really lovely conversation.
Good.
And as we were chatting, someone was waiting 6 feet behind her trying to buy a book, and it turned out it was Sharon's book. And Sharon was already out the door, so the woman and I ran after Sharon and got the book signed, and it was so exciting. And that customer is joining tonight from Louisiana. So it's really exciting that you all are this is a regional gathering, and
Mhm.
just so glad to see you, Becca. And
Ah.
thanks, Sharon, for partnering with us. And thank you, Evan, too.
And I'll just say, for those of you, of course, in the Austin area, I would be surprised if you don't know Bookwoman. But for those of you who aren't here in Austin, Bookwoman has been around for quite some time in our community. It is our feminist bookstore here in Austin, but also just such an amazingly curated collection of wonderful literature, nonfiction, memoir, literary fiction, commercial fiction, poetry, and run by one of the people who is a treasure here in our literary community, Susan, who's joining us tonight. So if you're here in Austin, you got to stop by. But if you're not, I got to tell you, and you're looking to spread your dollars around and support indie bookstores, you can't go wrong supporting Bookwoman. So for sure, check it out.
Yeah,
Thanks for
we'd
being
love to
here,
see everyone.
Mhm.
All right. So here we go. We are we're in for a real treat, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful presenter, and just so that you all know, I'll say a couple things. If you have questions throughout the evening, we will absolutely have time for them. So find the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, because it's going to be a lot easier if you drop a question in that box, since we have so much other fun stuff happening in the chat box. I don't want to lose your questions. We're going to start with a presentation, and then we're going to slide into a conversation between Sharon and myself, and then we're absolutely going to take some questions. So to get started, I'm going to read a little bio here. Sharon Ord-Warner is the author of 2 novels, a short story collection, and an edited anthology of stories on AIDS. Her craft book, Writing the Novella, was published on March 1st of this year. Sharon's essays and articles have appeared in the AWP Chronicle, The Writer, Writer's Digest, Studies in Short Fiction, Studies in the Novel, and others. Many of those articles went on to be republished in the year's Best Writing on Writing, The Writer's Handbook, Writer's Digest Yearbook, The Writer's Guide to Fiction, How to Write, Polish, and Publish Short Stories and Novels, Short Story Criticism, and others. From 1999 to 2016, she founded and directed the Taos Summer Writers Conference, one of the largest such gatherings in the country. She's Emerita Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of New Mexico and co-chair for the D.H. Lawrence Ranch Initiatives, which I feel like is our way to get on that D.H. Lawrence properties sometimes. So we're all going to keep that in mind. She lives here. She lives in Austin with her husband, where she's working on a book about Texas sculptress Elizabeth Ney. So please, everyone, give a big welcome in your chat box. Clap, clap, clap to Sharon. And I know, Sharon, you're gonna share your screen and throw up a presentation, right?
I am going to do so, and I will go ahead and start that now.
Great.
Okay.
I'm going to turn off my video. We're going to get into it, and then I'll circle back to you when you're done.
Okie doke. So let's see. PowerPoint. From the beginning. There we go. All right. So I assume everyone can see. If you can't, give me a chat. Give me some sort of a note. I'll assume you can see me now. So I'm going to begin with about a 20-minute talk. It's just an overview of the novella. I'm going to talk about the characteristics, the history, the origins, and the architecture of the novella. But what I'm discussing comes from the book, but there's a lot more in the book than what I'm addressing tonight. But it does get you introduced. I'm also going to incorporate a writing prompt, which is something that you can take away from this presentation and work on tomorrow or later tonight. It's a way for you to get started on your own novella, and the prompt is also included in the book. There are lots of prompts in the book, but this one fits very nicely into the talk. So I'll begin with a few facts about Hemingway and his novella, The Old Man and the Sea, and that's connected to the prompt that we'll be talking about. And so here it is. When he began his novella, his last book, The Old Man and the Sea, his fourth marriage was on the rocks. He'd received bad reviews for Across the River and Into the Trees, and I give you a quote from the Kirkus Review there, which a bitter disappointment is not what you want to hear when you publish a new book. He was aging and ailing, and he decided to funnel those emotions into the heart and mind of his protagonist, Santiago. He also used his life experience, his fishing expedition of 1935, when he and a friend reeled in a marlin so enormous it had to be tied to the side of the boat. By the time the sailboat reached the shore, the marlin had been half eaten by sharks. Now, I'm assuming that a lot of you have already read The Old Man and the Sea, maybe when you were in school. A lot of us read it in school. So you know that that very same thing happens to Santiago. So that's the beginning of the prompt. And now I'll move on to talk about the origins of the novella. The novella, that word, is Italian for little new thing, a term that was first used to describe a literary offering that was different from any that had preceded it. The new little thing that it described is a book called The Decameron, written by Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio's masterwork was not little. The current Penguin edition weighs in at 909 pages. The Decameron is a compilation of 100 tales, and the term novella, new little thing, refers to the individual stories that make up the book. It's fair to say that the Decameron was new in 1353. No one else had ever written anything like it. The backdrop for the book is the Black Plague of 1347 to 49, an outbreak that killed roughly 2/3 of the inhabitants of Florence, Italy. Boccaccio was a witness to that devastation. Like writers after him, like Elie Wiesel, who wrote the Holocaust novella memoir, Night, Boccaccio focused not on the event itself, but on the coping strategies of survivors. The premise of the Decameron is simple. As the plague sweeps through the city, 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, flee Florence for a compound in the mountains where they wait out the contagion and pass the time telling stories. Each night they have an agreed on theme: tragic love tales, happily ever after love tales, the power of human will, examples of virtue, to name only a few. Boccaccio based most of his 100 tales on earlier source material, but he added twists and reversals. He also made the storytellers individual characters, which gives their accounts an added dimension. Particularly significant for our purposes is the fact that Boccaccio used a framing device, the organizing structure of the Decameron, a backdrop of death that looms over the proceedings, lends depth and dimension to the slightest tale. The structure provides the gravitas. When we turn to the characteristics of the novella, you'll see that many of them are structured around frames and have an oral quality that wherein protagonists relay deeply affecting and life-changing stories. One such novella, Ethan Frome, serves as a touchstone in writing the novella. And by that, I mean I reference it in each chapter, discussing various parts of it. But there are 2 other books that I use as touchstones also. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is I forgot this one. This is the premise of the Decameron. And now we'll go on to what is a novella, the container analogy. So I think of fictional forms as containers. I imagine them as vases, but you can picture them as bowls or baskets or boxes. The point is that containers come in multiple sizes because they're made to hold varying amounts of things. And what we fill them with depends on the construction of the container. Fictional forms and containers. Fictional forms / containers hold narratives constructed of paragraphs that are composed of sentences built with words. If we use the container analogy to extend the discussion, then we can liken the short story or flash fiction to an apothecary bottle. Itsy bitsy, large enough to hold a teaspoon of water and a sprig of baby's breath. Most shorts can be read in the time it takes to eat a piece of toast. These flashes of insight come in under 1,000 words and most often under 500 words. What's in them, you wonder? Well, something small that hints at something more substantial. One of my favorites, Brady Udall's The Wig, weighs in at just under 350 words. Short stories vary in length from 1,000 to 10,000 words. The smallest are akin to bud vases, while the largest will accommodate a full bouquet. That said, it's important to note that definitions are subject to revision. In the past 20 to 30 years, the average length of the short story has shrunk from 25 pages to 15 or fewer. Classics that I first read as short stories, Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener and Kafka's Metamorphosis, for instance, have been recategorized. Both are currently considered novellas. Melville's masterpiece, which is a personal favorite of mine, weighs in at a scant 10,000 words, while Kafka's Tale of the Man Who Would Be Beetle comes in at 13,450. In the 1970s, when influential scholars began publishing books on the novella, neither classic would have been included. Mary Doyle Springer, the author of The Forms of the Modern Novella, specified the length of a novella as 15,000 to 50,000 words. John Gardner discussed novellas at some length in his 1983 creative writing text, The Art of Fiction, Notes on Craft for Young Writers. He put novellas at 30,000 to 50,000 words. In recent years, the small press publisher Melville House has exerted considerable influence on the public perception of the novella. Their series, The Art of the Novella, includes some 40 exemplars of the form, which range in length from 10,000 to 60,000. Note too that some of the classics that were published as novels, The Great Gatsby, for instance, might now be more accurately called novellas. At 49,455 words, The Great Gatsby just squeezes under the fence set by Springer and Gardner, but it has room to spare using the Melville House definition. A contemporary classic by Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street, which is also one of the touchstones for the book, was marketed as a novel when it was published in 1984. At 20,010 words, the book is a shortish novella. So now I'm going to talk a little about the characteristics of the novella. And I love this quote by Ian McEwan. And I reference it. I won't read it here, but it comes from an article called Notes on the Novella, which was published in the New Yorker a few years ago. And it's easy to find online. I really recommend reading it. I should have given the link to, I should have offered up the link to Becca, but I didn't think of it. Note. Okay, so now I'll move on. So we're not just talking about size, though. I've talked about the length of a novella, the number of words that's typically there, but remember that baskets and boxes and vases are made to help different kinds of things. And so we're also talking about kind. what goes in the container that we call a novella. Not just anything, as it turns out. As has been noted by those who admire the form, novellas are intermediate. They have the focus of short fiction, but they open onto a larger window, one that allows access to a life or lives in progress. That said, novellas are never panoramic, as a novel can be. The author, Ian McEwan, likens reading a novella to sitting in a theater, watching a play or a movie. If you've ever been to see a movie made from a sprawling novel, one you've read carefully and loved, then you understand that a screenplay container cannot hold the width and breadth of a big book. Attempting the adaptation of a novel, like this one, a big novel, a prudent screenwriter will dispense with a subplot or two or three. More of the story may end up on the cutting room floor. Occasionally, the finished product still sings, but never as loudly or as long as the novel. A steady focus. So the container that's a novella will only hold so much, and the narratives it serves best are those with a steady focus. A steady focus on what, you ask? I like the concise definition Philip Gerard provides in writing a book that makes a difference. A novella commonly follows the fortunes of a single character through a limited time in a circumscribed locale, focusing on a central idea. So let's start at the end of the definition and work our way back to the beginning. A central idea, which might be described as a theme or a focus, is one of the fundamental features of the typical novella. Novellas tend to be about something in particular. They aren't told in passing, but to make a point. Sometimes the point is to sound an alarm. Think of Animal Farm, communism, Things Fall Apart, colonialism, Fahrenheit 451, television, for instance. Often the point is holding a mirror to the ills of the world or society, of mice and men, mistreatment of the vulnerable, the house on Mango Street, inequality of women and minorities, passing, a societal preference for lighter skin color, and the awakening, suppression of women. About his novella, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, and its unlikely hero, a teenage boy with Asperger's syndrome, Mark Hayden had this to say in The Guardian. It's about how little separates us from those we turn away from in the street. It's about how badly we communicate with one another. It's about accepting that every life is narrow and that our only escape from this is not to run away to another country, another relationship, a slimmer, more confident self, but to learn to love the people we are and the world in which we find ourselves. Sure, it's important to entertain, but if you're writing a novella, you will likely also be entertaining an idea. And whatever the idea is, the subject matter must be of real consequence to you. Writers are at their best when they explore their fascinations and deeply held beliefs. So the next characteristic is in a specific locale. Novels are expansive. One of my recent favorite novels is The Signature of All Things by Elizabeth Gilbert, which takes off in Kew Gardens in southwest London and finds its ending on the island of Tahiti. In between, it touches down in various South American locales, on to Philadelphia, the Galapagos Islands, and, well, the rest is a blur. Novellas are not traveling books. By and large, they are situated and settled. They've got roots, thank you very much. Some are named for a place, just on Chesil Beach, in Dorset, southern England. A river runs through it, Missoula, Montana, Brokeback Mountain, Wyoming, house on Mango Street, Chicago barrio, snow country, a hot springs resort in Japan. Setting is so crucial in the construction of some novellas that place takes on the role of adversary. A river runs away. Heart of Darkness, the ocean, Old Man and the Sea, and a snowy New England town, Ethan Frome. Novellas are also written, also cover a short period of time. So they're situated in a certain place and they cover a short period of time, but you will find the occasional exception. For instance, Flaubert's novella, A Simple Life, skates delicately over decades of servitude that make up the life of Félicité, a French housemaid. But most novellas are circumscribed, spanning days or weeks, a season, or less often a year. They get in quickly, they have their say, and then they bid you a polite goodbye. Saul Bellows Sees the Day, for instance, covers 24 hours in the life of a young man named Tommy Wilhelm. Thomas Mann's Death in Venice spans a little bit over a month in the life of its central character, a middle-aged German writer. And one of my favorite novellas is Carson McCullers' The Member of the Wedding, which takes place over a few short days in August of 1944. Another characteristic is a small cast of characters. If a novel is a house that will hold an extended family and friends, a novella is a one-bedroom apartment. A single person can live there comfortably and easily accommodate a frequent guest. That guest might become a significant other, and the two could still be perfectly comfortable, assuming they're flexible when it comes to sharing a single bathroom. Most often, the story's main character is introduced on page 1 and remains at the forefront throughout. The novella may be named for the protagonist, as in The Great Gatsby, Ethan Frome, Sula, and McGlue, or the title may be a descriptor for the main character, as with the 2016 novella Convenience Store Woman by Japanese author Sayaka Murata. The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers and Steve Martin's Shop Girl also are examples of that. And that's Steve Martin, the actor, the comedian, the banjo player, the art collector, and the gifted fiction writer. It's just really not fair, is it? So one way or another, and sooner rather than later, the main character of a novella will find him or herself in opposition to someone or something. Usually the foil will be another person, but not always. In Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea, the antagonist is the sea, which refuses the elderly fisherman its bounty for 84 straight days. And the protagonist of Death in Venice becomes his own worst enemy when he remains in Venice during a cholera breakout. Because we are human beings and most of us live by and die by love, the struggle that ensues is often either romantic or familial. Take, for instance, Ethan Frome, besotted with his wife's cousin, Maddie. The antagonist is Ethan's wife, Zena, who decides to send Maddie packing. Jay Gatsby, nearly wealthy, dreams of reuniting with his former lover, Daisy, who is married now to established wealth in the person of Tom Buchanan. Family members can become formidable foes. As anyone who's read Kafka's Metamorphosis can attest, the novella form is ideal for showcasing all the ways we misinterpret the actions of loved ones. And a restricted point of view is also a feature of the novella. The narration of the novella is usually limited to one perspective, that of the protagonist, though there are exceptions. In the opening pages of On Chesil Beach, for example, author Ian McEwan provides the thoughts of both the bride and the groom, though the narrative finds its focus with the groom. The single perspective need not be the narrator's, however. Although short stories and novels rarely make use of the peripheral narrator and a frame structure, novellas often do. And here's where we see the influence of Boccaccio's Decameron. A peripheral narrator recounts someone else's experience, usually to a general audience. Nick Carraway is the peripheral narrator of The Great Gatsby. The story is not his, but he's privy to it. The same thing is true of the engineer who reconstructs the tragic tale of Ethan Frome, or the writer neighbor of Holly Golightly from Breakfast at Tiffany's. Before we move on, let me reassure you, your novella need not conform to any or all of the characteristics I've just mentioned, but when you begin weighing your story ideas, it will be helpful to consider these hallmarks. As Boccaccio, Shakespeare, Chaucer knew, and Goethe too, we don't write in a vacuum. We write out of a tradition. Over our lifetimes, we strive to contribute to that tradition, which is the least and the most any of us can do. And then I'm going to finish up by talking really briefly about the architecture of the novella. And this is one of the diagrams that's in the book. I define narrative arc as the framework or spine on which we hang our plots. You'll find a much more developed discussion of this subject in the book, but for our purposes, I'll get right to the point. Plays, screenplays, and novellas can be charted on Aristotle's incline because they are built around a single narrative arc, and you see that single narrative arc in the diagram. Most screenplays do include a B story, though. So if there was a B story, you could chart that in here too. But this is the main narrative arc. In his highly influential book on screenwriting, Save the Cat, Blake Snyder describes the B story as the subplot that contains the screenplay's theme and meaning. It takes two strings to strum, and the two narratives are twisted together to create meaning. A novella may also include a B story. However, most novels also contain a C story, a D story, and so on. To make a musical comparison, the short story is a song, the novella is a sonata, and the novel is a symphony. A song is a brief set of lyrics put to music. A sonata, a longer instrumental composition of 3 movements. And a symphony is an even more extended piece of music written for a full orchestra, usually with 4 movements, one of which is a sonata. It's easiest to grok the difference through a graphic. And so here you have one on the screen. This is what a well-developed novel might look like. Okay, so I'm going to finish up by giving you the rest of the writing prompt. You remember what I told you about Hemingway's last book. He won the 1954 Nobel Prize in Literature, and the committee cited the novella as one of the determining factors. He received the Nobel Prize in Literature, I think it was within a year of the publication of The Old Man and the Sea. Funneling his feelings of failure into his fiction led to the author's greatest success. Literary scholars contend that the Metamorphosis is a twisted version of Kafka's Life and Family. My novella, Treading Water, was sparked by the early and tragic death of a good friend. Just the other night, my son Devin, an RN, called to tell me that he wants to write a novella about his experience caring for COVID patients at the Coney Island Hospital in New York back at the beginning of the pandemic. So now I'm going to ask you, what about you? Do you have a real life experience that you want to fictionalize? Think about it. Maybe it fits the novella container. So next time you sit down to write, take a few notes. Ask yourself, does it have these characteristics? Might it make a good novella? If so, I hope you'll go for it. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and return the direction of the ship to Becca.
First of all, thank you so much for putting together that presentation for us. It's so kind of you, and I thought it was so helpful to just. First of all, I think the history of the novella is really interesting, and there's a good bit of that in the book as well. And then as you sort of break down those specific hallmarks to the novella, so I wanted to first say, before we get into some of the questions that I have for you, that I love your book. And I think, and what I really want to emphasize for everyone out there is that while it's called Writing the Novella, and there is absolutely a real progression to it in terms of how you sort of look at each of the elements one by one, the craft elements, and you give so much in this book. You give a lot of really great craft information. You give journaling suggestions for each chapter after you review a particular craft element. You talk about the habits of writers and how you establish your own habits. You talk about getting started. I just think that there's so much in it that is beyond simply tackling a novella, that I want to make sure folks know that. But absolutely, if you're working on a novella, you will be thrilled if you buy this book. So with that said, when we first started talking about this presentation and this WLT on the craft of writing topic, I said to you that I know nothing about the novella, and that I assumed novellas were just short novels. And so coming at it from a place of, I just figure it has to do with the length of it. And if you're working on a novel and it starts to peter out at some point, maybe it's just a novella, right? But obviously that's not true. There's so much more to the way we might define a novella. So first, I want to thank you for sharing the containers, because the container analogy, I think, is really helpful. What I want to ask you to start is, what sort of questions, and I think you touched on this, but if a writer comes to you and says, I'm not sure if what I'm writing should be a short story, I'm not sure if it should be a novella, I'm not sure if it's meant to be a fully fleshed out novel, what are the kinds of questions? Can you just go over those maybe one more time? What are the questions that you would tell a writer they might ask themselves at that moment to figure out which form is going to be the form for them?
Well, that's a great question. And I think a little bit of it is simply experimenting and developing your material. That's one reason that I developed an approach in teaching the novella workshop to have people work on key scenes rather than trying to start at the beginning and write your way through it. Because if you work on key scenes and you start to imagine it, then you get a better idea of what the scope is. It could be that when you're working on it, then you start realizing, oh, well, but this secondary character it has its own narrative arc. Okay, well, so if you have several characters who have their own narrative arcs, those are subplots. So then you know that you probably have a novel that you're working on. It's not really possible especially if you don't know exactly what your story is. If you don't have it all mapped out, it's not easy to decide what it is in advance. But a lot of times, I think the novella, if you think about, okay, I'm just going to limit, I'm going to write at something shorter. I'm going to take the intermediate step before I work on a novel, and I'm going to focus on one protagonist, and I'm going to focus on one place, and I'm going to focus on a short period of time, and I'm going to have a clear theme or focus. That's the novella. But certainly it's possible, as many people have done, to work on a short story and then turn it into a novel. I just read a book like that recently, and called, let's see, what's it called? I'm blanking on the title. I'll think of it in a minute, but I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, it does. One thing that I love that was helpful to me that you mentioned in the book is you talk about, and you have so many great metaphors and sort of analogies that help to like really help you wrap your head around some of this. But one thing you talk about is the large canvas versus the portrait, and the idea of, the novel is the large canvas, and the novella is the portrait. And as an artist, when you're doing a portrait, you have other elements to it, and certainly that subject is planted somewhere, but it really is about the subject. And I found that to be really helpful. And I imagine one of the things, as you're saying, if you feel like the story is really focused on one particular character, and that character in a very specific moment in time, in probably a specific place, that's helping you kind of get on your way to writing a novella versus maybe writing a novel.
Yes, I think if and I'm glad you brought up the portrait and large canvas, because that's a real indication too. And one book I would really recommend to people, if you haven't ever read it, is 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel by Jane Smiley. I reference it quite a few times in the book because she talks about a lot of these same issues, not about the novella, but she focuses on the novel. I just feel like, usually writers know when they start, if they know anything at all, they say, okay, it's about this character, or it's about this town. If it's about this town, it's probably not a novella. But if it's about this character, it may be. So I do think that looking at the characteristics of a novella will help you to figure out not only what container it fits in, but also how your story begins and ends, because then you can decide on the chronology. And I talk about that quite a bit in the book too.
Yeah, I wanted you to touch on that too, because can you talk about, there are so many things in the book that struck me as, you would bring up a particular idea or element like backstory. And you would say, this is what it means in a novella versus this is what it might mean in a short story or novel. And beginnings and endings, I think, is really interesting. So can you talk about, what are your thoughts for writers who are writing novellas in terms of when they're thinking about what the beginning is going to be and where you're going to be at the end?
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit more? Are these people that have already written, or they're just getting started to?
I think about towards the end of your book, when you talk about epiphany. And you sort of talk about how in short fiction, epiphany might be exactly where you end up, right? Whereas epiphany isn't everything in a novella, right? But that for novellas, but you focus on a character, and it's usually at a very important moment or a life-changing moment in their life. So with those sorts of things in mind, are you starting a novella closer to the rising tension, closer to the climax? Like, how are you thinking about where you start versus, and also where you end up?
Okay, so I think one of the characteristics that I talked about is the length of time that it takes place over a short period of time. Very few novellas take place over decades. So that's another thing, that if you know that your story, it takes place over a week or a month or 3 months, or you want to look at seasons, I think that fits really nicely into the novella structure, in which case you might begin, say, in summer and you end in spring or the next spring, you know, depending on what happens in the story. And, you know, when you're writing a short story, you want to get in and you want to get out really quickly. In a novella, you want to, you get in fairly quickly, and you get out, and you can get out sort of abruptly, but you often jump ahead in time. So you have a few, you might focus on a month or 2 months, and then you might jump forward in time to 6 months later. That's a frequent thing that you see in novellas. Where you end is going to be fairly close to where you begin. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. No, I feel like there's something else.
No, I think you're giving us lots to think about. And of course, you know, it's so specific to the story that you're telling. But I think about this book that you mentioned to me and that was on one of your slides, Convenience Store Woman. And I read it as I was reading your book as a sort of example of a novella, a contemporary novella, modern novella, and thinking about all of the different sort of those hallmarks that you talked about. And this book, especially when you talk about another thing that you mentioned in the book, is that often identity is the theme for a novella. Yes. So you talk about theme a little bit, you talk about these sort of, and especially in your presentation where you opened with novellas that have social commentary, specific goals in terms of the message that they're sharing. Can you talk about that specific theme, identity as theme, and how you, as you're crafting your novella, how that comes into the story?
Sure. Yes, identity is one of the most common themes for novellas, and you can almost look at so many different ones. And Convenience Store Woman is a very good example of that. I mean, the protagonist in that really takes her whole identity from the store, and then she pulls away from it. And then she comes back to it again. But the place and the person kind of bleed together. And I think that happens a lot in novellas, that somehow or another, the place and the person become either are at odds with each other, or they mingle and almost become each other. It's like impossible to identify the young woman as separate from the convenience store. She is the convenience store woman, and the pizza girl is the pizza girl. And so I think, and also I think that characters sometimes become identified with a certain period of time. So in A Member of the Wedding, the girl who's the protagonist, I think she's like 11. She is struggling not only with her family, but also with World War II and what's happening overseas and whether she should give her blood. And so she's trying to figure out who she is in her family, who she is as a citizen of the world and a citizen of the United States, who she is as a little girl in Georgia in the midst of this giant war. And so that's her identity struggle. So I think that a lot of novellas are also very much a social commentary. And I gave some examples of those in the talk, but there's lots of others that you can talk about that are examples too, like James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, several of Toni Morrison's novellas. Toni Morrison wrote quite a few novellas, and the ones she wrote tend to have very strong social. Well, of course, everything she wrote have a very strong social message too. But if you want to write about an issue, a topic, You don't want it to be, polemic, but you want to somehow or another impress upon people a particular idea. The novella is a great way to go.
So you mentioned Toni Morrison, and I was sort of joking before we started the formal presentation tonight that I have read a lot of novellas and I had no idea. And that, of course, there are a lot of classic novels that you mentioned that are actually novellas. Toni Morrison wrote mini novellas, but even, whether it's Toni Morrison's books, whether it's Convenience Store Woman, which clearly on it says a novel
Yes.
from the publisher. I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of the way that publishing thinks of novella. You've given us some really great, almost a definition of some of the things that, whether it's word count or then the specific craft elements, but yet publishing resists putting a novella on the jacket of a book. What are your observations about publishing and novellas?
Well, I've written a whole essay on that subject, but I think it's a little bit controversial. I'm hoping.
Love controversy. Bring on the controversy.
I'm hoping to publish it before too long, but I talk about that the whole issue of why I think it would be better to have truth in advertising when it comes to literature, and not the novella is not less than a novel, and it just is a short story and a short. They're not lesser forms. They're not as serious or as important. I think that's a bogus kind of way of looking at literature, and it's really detrimental to writers, and it's detrimental to readers too. One of the things I talk about in this essay is several recent publications that are not novellas, but that are marketed as novels. And that happens in the United States. It doesn't happen as much overseas. It doesn't happen as much. I don't know that it happens nearly as much in Europe, or specifically in Europe, in Sweden, in France. I talk about that, some specific examples in France and Sweden and Germany, where things are labeled novellas, where in bookstores, there's whole tables that are short reads, novellas, as opposed to longer reads, novels. And in the United States, I think it's because I think it's a money issue. Publishers want to charge the same amount, or roughly the same amount, for a 350-page book and a 180-page book. And in order to do that, they call them the same thing, a novel. But I think that's misleading and also confusing. So for instance, Ann Tyler published a book called Redhead by the Side of the Road about a year ago. And that book is a novella, very clearly a novella. I talk about why it's a novella. Don DeLillo published a book called The Silence about maybe 8 months ago. And that book is only 90 pages, and it's called a novel too. But it's a novella. It takes place over one day, I think, or 2 days, something like that. I mean, it has all the hallmarks of a novella, but I know from talking to some other writers and just my own experiences that if you wanted to call your book a novella, you either would have to write 2 or 3 novellas and put them together into one book, or you would have to publish it with a small press, like Coffee House, say, or then you could probably call it a novella. but it confuses writers, and they somehow think that they have to either write something that is that big in order for it to be a real novel and be published as a novel, which is not really true. They can publish a short book, and people and the publisher will call it a novel, but it's not really one. I don't know if that helps at all, but what I was going to say about Ann Tyler's book is that when I looked at the readers' reviews, on Amazon, there were so many people who had ordered it digitally, thinking it was a long book, a novel, and when they read it and they were mad, they were furious. They were like, "This is not a novel." And they didn't necessarily say it's a novella. A few people did. I give examples of that in the essay. But I think if people knew that they were buying a novella, that would be good. And they might want to buy a novella. They might want to read it just on the plane, say, or on an afternoon at the beach. So I just think of it as a truth in advertising issue, but it is confusing.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions that we had. And just a reminder to folks, if you have questions for Sharon, for sure, stick them in the Q&A. But that was one of the questions we had, was sort of that idea of readers wanting more for their money and novellas being too short. And it seems like publishing is going to want to price what they're going to want to price it at. And so that's where you bump up against that. And I think that it is true these days that authors who are brand name authors who have an established following are maybe there's a little more wiggle room for them to publish a shorter novel, to publish a novella and call it a novel. But when you're just doing when you're writing your debut, it might be that the market and the industry demands that it be longer.
Yes, although I do think that's changing to some degree, in part because of digital publishing, and also because there are a lot more small presses, and there's people are publishing their own books too. They're self-publishing things, and so they can call them, they can use accurate terms. And I think that's helpful both for readers and for writers. So, I mean, I think publishing with small presses, you have more latitude, and there's one reason in the back of the book I include a list of publishers who publish novellas. There are a couple places that specialize in that, and there are also a number of competitions specifically for novellas. And there's a whole list of those in the back of the book, so that people have some ideas about where they can send their novellas. I mean, there's a big market for novellas in YA. And also, and there again, they might not call it a novella, but very, very often YA books are novella length and have the same characteristics. But also science fiction. There's actually quite a few publications of science fiction novellas, and they are calling them novellas. So that was something I learned a lot when I was researching for this book. And so those are things that are in the back for folks to look at.
Yeah, your resources in the back of the book are wonderful. There's so much there for folks. What do you think of, so we've talked so much about the character, a specific character, the specific character's point of view, and how that sort of intersects with the setting. So one of our questions is, what about a novella written in third person omniscient point of view? Is that just unheard of? Or can you think of some examples of novellas that, I mean, not to put you on the spot, but what do you think when you hear, would that would that be a turnoff? Would that be something that would happen with a novella today? Third person omniscient.
So, yes, third person omniscient. I wrote a novel in the third person editorial omniscient. And the problem with the omniscient is there's a tendency to kind of go all over the place. I do think you can write I do think you could write a novella in the omniscient, but I would think that you would want to make it a very short period of time. So depending on how many characters you had, you've got to limit it somehow. See, so if you're going to have multiple protagonists in a way, or no protagonist in a way, then you've got to make it compact in some other ways. So, and I would think time would be the most obvious of those. But I think I give an example or two of an omniscient narrator in the point of view chapter, where I use my son Devin's story. My son Devin always tells funny stories, and so I use this one. Let's see. So, third person omniscient. Oh, Animal Farm by George Orwell is in the third person omniscient. And On Chesael Beach is too, but it focuses mostly on one character. And The Old Man and the Sea is too, evidently. I'd forgotten that. But those are the three.
Yeah, it is.
Those are the three examples I give. So I think I'm sure there are plenty of others, but those are the examples I give in the book. And I'd love if other people find some, shoot me an email. I'd love to hear about them. So yeah, I think you can do that. Just keep the time period short.
So we're starting to go close to our time, and I don't see any new questions that we haven't covered in the Q&A. So I just wanted to ask you a couple more questions first. And I think you've named a few of these, but are there any other sort of novellas that have been published very recently that you would recommend to folks? I think Convenience Store Woman is a great recommendation. And is there anything else that you would say if you want to go out and explore the novella, and especially look at it in terms of publishing today? What would you recommend?
Okay, well, and I do have a list of those in the back of the book too. So I'm going to look at those just so to be sure I'm not going to forget something. But I've read a few books really recently. Like the book I just got, I'm not sure it's a novella yet because is Rachel Cusk's book, Second Place. It looks to me like it might be novella length, but I haven't read it yet, so I don't know whether really it's a short novel. It's definitely a short novel. But one that came out last year, Children's Bible, by, isn't it Lydia Millay? Is that it? Is that her last name? That was up for several awards, and that is definitely a novella. There's I give some names of some other examples, recent books. Obviously, Stephen King has published a bunch of novellas, right, and his most recent book is a collection of novellas, and that's one of the things I also wanted to mention to people before our time's up. Is that there are some really interesting novella collections, which I also have. I have a list of those. Like Rick Bass in 2019, he published a book called Platte River, which is 3 novellas.
Yeah, one of our readers or one of our folks in the Q&A mentioned that idea too of, packaging a couple of novellas, 2 or 3 novellas together. Can you think of any examples? I love this question from Chris, who I believe you met at Bookwoman. Any examples of novellas where, there's so much focus on the protagonist, there's so much focus on that, where the protagonist dies, where you kill off that character?
Yes, there are several. Of course, the great classics that I mentioned in the talk, The Metamorphosis and Bartleby the Scrivener. Both of those characters die. Let's see, what are some contemporary examples of? Yes, actually, that happens. That happens not infrequently, because novellas do tend to be dark. I didn't really talk about that, but that is definitely. I mean, they're not always dark, but they do. Okay. Daisy Miller, our one of our participants, says Brokeback Mountain, Daisy Miller,
Awakening. Yeah.
The Awakening. The Awakening is a great example of that. And so thanks. Yes. Oh, somebody else says Billy Budd.
We have so many novella aficionados here tonight. I'm really impressed by all of the folks who are weighing in with their knowledge of novellas. One last thing I'll ask you is, it feels like, it feels like in some ways, with all of these rules, or with the word count, that there's almost, do you think the novella is restricting in some ways, in terms of, as a writer, if you focus on writing a novella, are you being sort of held back or kept in a small box versus the freedom of that larger canvas? What do you think about that? Or do you think there's something freeing about following certain expectations and giving yourself, at least those guideposts to write by?
That's a great question. I think it depends on what you want from your experience, but as a writer, what you want your writerly experience to be in the process of that writing project, and also what you want the reading experience to be like. One of the things I talk about in the book, and that I kind of touch on a little bit in the presentation, is that novellas, in my opinion, have more in common with screenplays than they do with novels, because that's why novellas make excellent movies. And so you see a lot of novellas that end up being adapted for the screen because they have about the same amount of material in them. If you want to have a really big container, and you want to be able to basically throw everything into it, and I mean, that's the thing though, is that novels take a long time to write, and they're really messy, and so you have to think about, okay, what is it I want to do? How much can I accomplish? But also, like, what's my end goal? What kind of experience do I want my readers to have? And so I don't think there's any good. I think it's great to write short stories. I think it's great to write shorts. I mean, I think some of us are better at one form than another. Somebody's like, there's so many interesting chats coming up here. It's getting distracting, Becca. But I'm like, oh yeah. But so I really think it depends on what you want to get out of your writing project, mm-hmm. and your writing time. And
and just to circle back to where we sort of started this conversation, I think it was just it's so true. And you do such a great job in the book of kind of step by step taking people through that process of kind of figuring out what their story is, who their characters are, what is going to happen, what's your theme, but really starting with that idea of just write a scene, mm-hmm. and then write another scene, and then start to figure out what you have from that. And maybe don't pressure yourself into saying, I'm writing a novel, I'm writing a novella, I'm writing a short story. Kind of start getting it down on the page, and then let yourself examine it a little later, right?
Exactly. And I mean, one of the ways in which I think this book might be helpful to people is people who want to take part in Novel Writing Month in November. What is it? I always say it wrong. NaNoWriMo. Yeah. Because, you can easily, I think this gives you a framework for writing a short novel, which 50,000 words, I think, is what you're supposed to come up with in NaNoWriMo. And that's a novella. So, I think starting with scenes and starting with a narrative arc, and then being willing to change it and you can move scenes around. They're portable. That's what I love about scenes. So, and they're easy to change, and they're great to workshop in writers groups. So I'm all for scenes.
I love that you just mentioned National Novel Writing Month, because I think that's so true. Your book is perfect for that. I mean, if you're setting out and you're giving yourself a certain amount of time to get your story down, I really do think this book is perfect for someone who might have a spark of an idea, might even have some pages already, but is really just trying to like work through it. So I can't recommend it enough to everyone who's listening. We've dropped the link to Bookwoman, where you can find it and support our wonderful partner bookstore, but absolutely check out the book. And I think that is all the time we have, though. So I just want to say a big thank you to you, Sharon, for doing this, for the presentation that you started with, which was really wonderful, and also for just being willing to introduce the novella to me. Everyone else here already knows it, but to give me a little more of an idea of this really interesting form. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, it was my pleasure. And thank you for all you do to maintain and grow a writing community in Texas. And also, I mean, I saw that there were people from all over the United States at this event, which is one of the great things about Zoom. So yeah. I'm deeply appreciative. I totally believe in growing and sustaining a writing community. That's why I did a writers conference. So thank you for what you do, Becca. And thank you, Susan Post, if you're still here, because that's such important work. And so I do hope everybody, if you want to buy a book, please buy it from Bookwoman. I'd love that. And I'd be happy to sign, to come in and sign books whenever they'd like me to, if that's something that people would like. So great, it was fun. I hope to do more things with you in the future, Becca.
For sure. You're not going to be able to get rid of us. And thank you to everyone out there who's been here for this presentation. We really appreciate you. Check out our other recordings on YouTube. Check out our website. Come hang out with us anytime. And have a great night, everyone. Have a good rest of your Thursday.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye, Becca.
Bye-bye.